not the 15th.
That's the difference, right? It's,
You're already there, it's schmooze.
It's
The date got
smooth.
changed.
It's
You say learn,
smooth.
it's not.
Oh, all right. Booking, reading and schmoozing is not the same thing.
no. Schmoozing is schmoozing and booking is booking.
Okay, good. All right, now we cleared that up.
Okay, so Arun is saying that he's not sure if he's a co-host yet.
Not quite yet.
Okay.
Isn't that a
Well,
kind
we've
of,
got a few more people, so we're all set.
isn't that a kind of salmon?
Co-host? No, that's terrible.
Yeah, something like that.
No S.
All right, so Arun is now a co-host.
All right.
All right. And let's see, and hello, Marty. And hello, Lauren and Petra, or just Lauren or just Petra, depending on who's sitting there. We can't quite see you, but nice to have you. Hello, Adina.
Hello,
So glad you're here.
I am too.
All right, good. So Sherry, oh, and there's someone else. Oh, and Esther has joined us. Great. Well, just for a moment.
I'm going to sign off.
All right,
Bye-bye.
sounds good. And Gail is here. Hello, Gail. All right, that's great. And so there's going to be a little bit of churn here because the people who have, okay. Let's see. Oh, and we have Judy now. Great. Okay. Judy. All right.
Right there.
Okay.
Right there.
All right, good. I think that's everybody, Arun. Well, we'll see if people come on, then we'll greet them when they arrive. So Sherry, I think I'm going to try again to turn it over to you.
Okay, so I'm hosted or something? I'm co-hosting now? Or can you unmute? Are you going to stay? You're staying, right? But you have to unmute.
I'm staying
Okay.
because we have to do the polls, and I'm not sure that those are transferable.
Okay,
So I'm going to be here to try to work out the polling situation.
okay, well,
And anyway, and I want to hear about this. As I was telling someone earlier, Harry Potter was a very important part of my children's childhood, albeit in English, not in Hebrew or Russian or certainly not Yiddish. And so this is just a topic of great interest to me. So I want to be here.
well, I just want to welcome Arun. We're thrilled to have you. And I thought I'd just say a few words about how this whole thing came to be. Jim and I read about your translation of Harry Potter into Yiddish in the foreword. And then we saw an article about it too in the Jewish Review of Books. And I said, oh, this is Schmooze and Learn. We have to have him. And we used to chat with Arun in the hallway between the Worship and Study Minyan and Harvard Hillel Orthodox. And so we knew him, and I felt like, well, I have a little pull here, a little yuccas. And so I tried to figure out how to get in touch with him. So I looked up on LinkedIn, Arun Viswanath, and I found one and I contacted him and I asked him to come speak, and it was the wrong one. And he said, oh, that's okay. I'm a expert in cybersecurity, but if you want me to come, I'll be happy to come talk about that anytime. So then we turned to Jim. It turned out that Jim had an old email address from way back when Arun was an undergraduate at Harvard. And we contacted him, and sure enough, there he was. So this is how it all came about, and we're thrilled to have him. I just also want to mention, it's not on his biography that we sent out, that Arun's grandfather was, as my husband Jim says, the great Yiddish scholar in America. And so Arun comes, that's how he is referred to. And he comes to it as Yiddish legitimately. And his mother is a Yiddish poetess, if I'm correct. And his aunt is the editor of the Yiddish Forward. So without further ado, my great pleasure, Arun, you're on.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction, Sherry, and I'm so glad that we got to reconnect. I'm seeing so many familiar faces here. Thank you guys so much for joining me. I feel incredibly fortunate to just be able to come and talk with old friends and make new acquaintances and bond over the magic of Harry Potter and the magic of Yiddish. So I've prepared a set of slides. So I'm going to try to share my screen now and I'm sorry, this part is always so unprofessional. It's okay. Here we go. Are you able to see my slides?
Not quite yet, but it says that you've started screen sharing. So
Okay.
God willing, the magic of Zoom will. There we go.
Okay.
Awesome.
Wonderful. I'll also add that turns out the name Arun Viswanath, I didn't know this growing up in Teaneck, New Jersey, which is kind of the king of the modern Orthodox Jewish suburbs. But the name Arun Viswanath is the kind of like the John Smith of South India. So there are many of me, which I only learned much later in life.
Yeah, this person that I went to accidentally said there were 5 that he knew of.
I've come to know many over the years through similar snafus. So before we get to the meat of the matter, I just want to provide a little bit of background for those who aren't as familiar. Yiddish is the traditional vernacular of Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews. It developed somewhere between the beginning of the 1100s and the beginning of the 1600s, depending on which controversial scholar you ask. But by the eve of the Second World War, there were at least 11 million speakers of Yiddish worldwide. And even today, Yiddish is a widely spoken language. Today, much more among the elderly, among those who grow up hearing Yiddish in their homes from their immigrant parents or their immigrant grandparents or other relatives. And of course, the majority of Yiddish speakers today, or at least the majority of young Yiddish speakers, are typically religious Jews, either Hasidic Jews or Lithuanian ultra-Orthodox Jews. Yiddish has an incredibly rich literature. Of course, this is a picture of Shalom Aleichem, who is known as one of the Drei Klassiker, the 3 classical Yiddish writers, along with Mendel Sfarim and Yud Lamed Peretz. And they were, I suppose, the vanguards of modern Yiddish literature. And that body of literature bloomed tremendously, especially in between World War I and World War II, but continues to grow today. There's a little bit of an echo, so I might ask everybody just to mute themselves or perhaps put in headphones. Thank you. I am perhaps not the most typical Yiddish speaker. The secular, or shall we say the non-Hasidic group of Yiddish speakers, often referred to as Yiddishists, are much smaller in number and are distributed across the entire world. As we say in Yiddish, zezeit and zespreit, scattered about. But my family happens to have been very serious about Yiddish, and my grandfather and my grandmother were determined to pass it on to their children, of which they had 4. And they all passed on Yiddish to their children. So this is a picture of myself and a cousin of mine who I speak Yiddish with, hiding in a box, unclear why. But we all speak Yiddish with each other. As I've grown older and made friends with a wider array of people, I've discovered that there are Yiddishists on all 4 corners of the globe. And that number of people who are interested in Yiddish topics or interested in the Yiddish language, or who have even learned the Yiddish language to fluency, are great in number. And of course, there's a tremendous portion of world Jewry, of course, Ashkenazic world Jewry, that speaks Yiddish to varying degrees of fluency. So growing up, I had Yiddish children's books. There was Yiddish children's literature that was published mainly before World War II, and that wasn't particularly shiny. We did also have shiny Hasidic children's literature, which tended to be a little bit narrower in its themes and tended to be a bit more explicitly moralizing. And so those started to grate on me as I became an adolescent. And of course, when I grew up, this was in the mid 90s, early 2000s, Harry Potter was all the rage. And I always had the feeling of, well, you know, maybe if I had something in Yiddish that felt popular, that I felt like other people, my peers, could relate to, then I would feel like I could really feel proud of my mother tongue. So Harry Potter is certainly not new to translation. At least the first book has been translated into over 80 languages. And the series itself in English is, I believe, the best-selling book series of all time. The best-selling book of all time, I believe, is the Bible. Check with Rabbi Jim. Thank you. So
Probably the Christian Bible, not the Hebrew Bible.
well, yeah. So I suppose, let's say the Hebrew Bible in translation has been featured in the best-selling book of all time. So translating Harry Potter was something that I decided I have to do. So poll number 1, Rabbi Jim, let's see if we can get this pulled up. If it doesn't work, no problem. I'll just exit out of my slides and restart it. I'm going to ask you guys to provide some input related to Harry Potter in translation. So be prepared with your keyboard at your fingertips.
Harvey, I'm using Group Begon and it's working.
Okay, I'll just try it myself. You guys will just see a blank screen for a second. Here we go. Okay. Get your answers in. Have you read Harry Potter in translation? Hope everybody's able to see the poll. All right, we have quite a number of people who've only read the original, one person who's not sure why they're here. Okay, great. Okay, so we have a lot of people who are going to be at least have a passing familiarity with the original text. So we're going to have a lot of fun. Okay. 9 of 14. I'll give you guys another 10 seconds for the last 5 people to get in an answer if they would like. Okay, so I'm going to hit end poll and then share results. Okay, so 78% of those who responded have only read the original. The other 22 are not quite sure what I'm talking about. Wonderful.
Yeah, and I can say, Arun, for some reason, I am not privy to any of the polls, even though I put them in the.
Oh, it's okay.
So I apologize, but I can say that I've read it multiple times, twice at least to my children, and then certain of the series to myself because I couldn't wait for my children to grow up fast.
There isn't a option that fits my tendency to respond because I'm certainly familiar with Harry Potter and I've even seen a Harry Potter movie, but I've never read Harry Potter in any language.
That's fair. I'm sorry to force you into the Harry Who option.
Yeah.
If I recall correctly, when I put in 5 options, it starts getting cut off. So I went for the aesthetic instead of the practical. So, right, okay. I already talked about why Harry Potter in Yiddish. But of course, translating Harry Potter into any language, translating anything into any language comes with certain complexities. But when translating,
Open the window. Yeah,
when translating Harry Potter into Yiddish, there is some additional complexity. First of all, because it is such a well-known work, and the names of all the characters and the storyline are so ingrained into the minds, certainly of my generation, those of us who grew up with the book, that you have to be very careful about what you decide to translate and what you want to keep by itself. But second of all, and perhaps more interestingly, Yiddish, more than, let's say, typical national languages like Spanish or French or even Chinese, Yiddish very much has a Jewish character that's inherent to it. It's very difficult to achieve a neutral tone when speaking in Yiddish. And this is, of course, because Yiddish was spoken for many centuries by only Jews. And so naturally it developed to match the needs of Jews to express themselves and the things that they talk about. So, of course, I suppose I could have gone the route of calling Hermione Chana and Harry Herschel and Ron Reuven, but I decided to do that, not to do that, first of all, because I knew that for myself, in my mind, his name is Harry, her name is Hermione, his name is Ron. Perhaps I might Yiddishize it a tiny bit just to make the sounds fit the language a little bit better, but to completely change the name of the characters, I felt would be a little bit too much. And then, of course, I'm quite sure that the author and her agency would not stand for such an infringement on the characters. So, all right, it is time for our second poll. And I'm now going to stop this poll, switch to the second poll. Aha. Okay, which house are you in? So I'll read the names of the houses. I apologize for anybody who has no familiarity with the houses. Gryffindor is Golden Griff. Hufflepuff is Hufflepuff. Sounds Yiddish enough. Ravenclaw is Robbenkrell. And Slytherin is Samderin. What house are you in? In fact, you know what? Oh wow, we have a lot of Gryffindors. This might actually be a good time for me to read the Sorting Hat song. For those of you who are familiar with this, one of the early chapters in the first book has the Sorting Hat, which determines which house each student that has just entered Hogwarts is to be sorted into, sings a song describing the houses. So for those of you who are not quite sure what house you're in, I will go ahead and read the Sorting Hat song. First, I'll read a stanza in English, and then I will read a stanza in Yiddish. All right. Oh, you may not think I'm pretty, but don't judge on what you see. I'll eat myself if you can find a smarter hat than me. Now in Yiddish. Es ist mein Ponem nicht kein Schönheit, nor die Schönheit gar nicht sagt. Gege fin mir noch a Hittel, was a Kopf wie meins vermogt. You can keep your bowlers black, your top hats sleek and tall, for I'm the Hogwarts Sorting Hat, and I can cap them all. Hey, du Kepke, Kutschme, Kapelich, du Streimelois Gepitzter, seid ihr Meuchel, ich bin das der Same kommt zu Nutzter. There's nothing in your head the Sorting Hat can't see, so try me on, and I will tell you where you ought to be. Der Hogwartser Sortierhut weist dein Ätzem und dein Kern. Du mest mich on und Herr me Venus, wem du tust gehern. And now we're getting to the houses. You might belong in Gryffindor, where dwell the brave at heart. Their daring, nerve, and chivalry set Gryffindors apart. Zu Goldengriff gehören die mit Herz, galant und dreist. Sie teilen sich aus mit Gwure, otazav was Gwure heißt. You might belong in Hufflepuff, where they are just and loyal. Those patient Hufflepuffs are true and unafraid of toil. Gehörst du wieder Hufflepuff, dem Joischer haltst du teier, meinst nicht ois die Horavanje, und bist ständig a Getreier. Or yet in wise old Ravenclaw, if you're a ready mind, where those of wit and learning will always find their kind. Beschert zu sein in Robbenkrell is der mit scharfen Sinnen, wo Anhängers von Wissen und von Klugschaft sich gefinnen. Or perhaps in Slytherin, you'll make your real friends. Those cunning folks use any means to achieve their ends. Sie efter treffst du echte Freund in Samdrin dem Chitren, wo abi dem Ziel der Griechen seinen Koscher alle Mitteln. So put me on, don't be afraid, and don't get in a flap. You're in safe hands, though I have none, for I'm a thinking cap. To tu mich onit, schreck sich nicht, ich leg auf dir kein Hand. Ich bin fort bloß a Sortierhut, gar a freundlich Stück Gewand. Okay, so it looks like during that we did not get any additional poll responses, but it looks like the majority of you guys are, oh, okay, all right, we have a Hufflepuff coming in hot. And a Ravenclaw, another Slytherin. Okay, now they're really coming in. I'll give you another 5 seconds.
I love that Strymel for the hat.
Sometimes you have to get creative. I wasn't quite sure how to say bowling hat in Yiddish, but Strymel I know. Strymel, of course, is the round, large, furry hat that many Hasidim wear.
Yeah.
Alrighty, so I'm going to end the poll, share the results so you guys can see this, and I'm going to go back to the slides. And now share screen. And okay. Alrighty, so we just went through the 3 Hogwarts houses. There's Golden Griff, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Samdrin. Now, for Slytherin, I could have just gone with getting rid of the eth sound, that th sound, and saying Slytherin, but it didn't feel quite good. I didn't really feel like it flowed, and it was also missing the symbolism of the term Slither, of course, right? Slytherin, what do you call this? The shield of the coat of arms. There we go. Of Slytherin is a snake, and that is their mascot. So we needed some sort of snake metaphor. So I ended up with taking the word for poison or venom, sam, and adding it to derin, which means therein or inside. And that's how we got samderin, which literally means venom therein or contains poison, which is, of course, appropriate for Slytherin's cunning character. Wow, all right, it's time for another poll. And launch poll number 3. Okay, the villain in Harry Potter. His name is spelled Voldemort. Some people say it's pronounced Voldemort. Others say it is Voldemort. Which is it? Okay, the audience is quite split here. I'll wait till we get to 10 answers. And then we will do the big reveal. Okay, 50% is good enough. Okay, so we have 3 people who said it's Voldemort, 3 people who say it's Voldemort, and 2 who say it's a little bit of one and a little bit of the other. And the correct answer is, it is a little bit of one and a little bit of the other. The author insists that it is pronounced with that the T is not pronounced, and that it should be said as Voldemort. However, she herself has been caught on tape saying Voldemort. So you be the judge. Fortunately for me, that gave me a little bit of wiggle room in terms of how I was going to transcribe the name. And of course, how the name is transcribed is quite important in translation, because there is a tricky little anagram that comes up at the end of the second book, where Voldemort reveals that his childhood name, Tom Marvolo Riddle, rearranges to become I am Lord Voldemort, or Lord Voldemort. So I had to work very, very hard to figure out what that anagram is. I won't reveal it to you because I'm still working between 2 or 3 examples, and the second book has not come out yet. But luckily, I was able to lean on both options of Voldemort and Voldemort. I went with Voldemort. Another interesting place where I was able to get a little bit creative with the Yiddish is in the Mirror of Erised. This is a mirror which is placed inside of the Chamber of Secrets and elsewhere in the Castle of Hogwarts. That when the person looks inside, they see not their reflection, but they see their deepest heart's desire. And atop the frame of the mirror, there is what appears to be gibberish, which when read backwards reads as, I show not your face, but your heart's desire. So, of course, translating it into Yiddish, it would be straightforward as translating any other part of the book, but I wanted the gibberish to really read like Jewish gibberish. So how does one do that? Well, it turns out that there is a phrase in Yiddish when one wants to say that something is gibberish. Of course, there's many ways to say that something is gibberish in Yiddish. One way is to say that it is Targum Lashon, which literally means the language of the Targum, the language of the Aramaic translation of the Torah. So I thought, I wonder if there's a way that I could make this read backwards to look like Aramaic. So the Yiddish ended up being Nicht das Ponem in mir seh, nor dem Herzbegehr. Not the face in me you see, but rather the heart's desire. And when we turn that backwards, we get a lot of words that end in an aleph, which, I mean, it's not comprehensible Aramaic, so it's still gibberish, but it reads a little bit like Aramaic. So that was an opportunity for me to have a little bit of fun and a little bit of wiggle room that the original didn't quite get a chance to do.
There are a lot of magic spells in Aramaic already.
Indeed.
So, and a lot of them are not exactly word for word comprehensible.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And of course, there's many strings of epithets of God, or supposedly epithets of God, which read as these long strings of gibberish. So the Jewish tradition has a long history with gibberish, and particularly in Aramaic. Thanks for bringing that up. Quidditch. So now we're dealing with some of the made-up words in Harry Potter. There is a school of thought which traces the name of Quidditch to a combination of the 3 balls that are used in the sport. Now, of course, for the uninitiated, Quidditch is the most popular wizarding sport that is played while flying on brooms, throwing a quaffle into any of the 3 goal hoops on either side of the field. The other two balls that are in the game are the bludgers and the snitch. So some say that Quidditch comes from quaffle plus bludger plus snitch, which is quite clever. I didn't think that I could top that, and I also wasn't sure if I wanted to mess with a word which didn't really appear to have any clear sound symbolism. But then I remembered that there's this saying in Yiddish, which some of you who speak Hebrew may also be familiar with, as Gott will schießt a Besen, which literally means if God wills it, even a broom can shoot or sprout. For the Hebrew speakers, and it essentially means anything is possible. And of course, the subset of anything that is possible is people flying around on brooms. So I tried to compress this saying into just a single word, and I got schieß, which means shoot, and Besen, which is broom, and I got schießbesen. So in Yiddish, the word for Quidditch ended up being shoot broom. All right, I know we're coming up on half an hour. I know we've got a little bit of a late start. What time do we want to stop at? I want to make sure that we leave time for questions. I brought plenty of examples, and I'm sure that there are some folks who might want to share or ask questions. So how much time do we have?
Oh, you can go on. It's so fascinating. I hope you'll go on a little longer. Another, yeah, at least another 8-10 minutes, I think.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
Moving right along. Okay. Poll number 4. Well, let's leave the questions for the end, and we'll just go through this. Poll number 4. Okay, I promise this is the last poll. The potato or other ingredient containing pudding, although I don't believe that's a truly accurate translation of the word kugel kegel, is pronounced differently for different people. So let us know, how do you pronounce this delicious food? Oh my.
As I understand it, Yiddish scholars have a map of Europe, and there's a line that separates the kugel from the kegel.
Well, now there's an armistice there, but previously.
Now we're all in Gullus, we're all in exile, and we're all mixed up with each other. And yet somehow, wow, okay, this poll is getting more responses than any of the others. 5 more seconds. Okay. As a Southern Yiddish speaker, I have to say I'm a little bit disappointed in you guys. Unanimously, kugel. I'm assuming that the other ones who didn't respond are into kegel, but I won't judge you if you're not. So let's go back to the slides here. Okay, can everybody see the screen again? Yes. Okay. Sorry. So kugel is the pronunciation of this term, which is, shall we say, endemic to the northern regions of Europe, those who typically identify as Lithuanian or Belarusian Jews. Jews from further south, Jews from Ukraine, from Poland, from Hungary would say kegel. So why do I bring this up? Yiddish dialects play a very important role in the, shall we say, the folklore and the playfulness of Yiddish. There's a famous theater song called I'm a Litvak and she's a Galitz about what many used to call mixed marriages between those of Litvak heritage and those of Galicianer, meaning Southern heritage. But those dialects also come with stereotypical, right? These are caricatures, so nobody take offense. We're caricaturing ourselves here. But the stereotype tends to be that Litvaks, those of Lithuanian heritage, those who say kugel, tend to be a bit more buttoned up, perhaps a little bit on the cooler side, cool in terms of cool demeanor, not particularly warm, a little bit stringent, whereas Galicianers tend to be very warm and perhaps a little bit country bumpkin. So I thought, well, if the characters are already speaking Yiddish, there's going to be an assumption that they're speaking some sort of, some variety, some dialect. So I had to be very careful about what dialect to give which people. But some people were kind of a dead giveaway, right? So this is Professor McGonagall. The door swung open at once. A tall, black-haired witch in emerald green robes stood there. She had a very stern face. And Harry's first thought was that this was not someone to cross. In other words, a Litvak. So I had her speaking in Litvish Yiddish, which not only means a slightly different pronunciation, which is not always reflected in the spelling, but also slightly different vocabulary, slightly different syntax. The way that verbs are conjugated are slightly different. So subtle, but still very important. And then, of course, we have Hagrid, who in the original comes from the West Country of England. I don't really know what that means, but I do know that it means that he has kind of a bumbling, stumble over himself, warm kind of demeanor. And so I gave him a Warsaw-style Galicianer accent. And then for a character like Dumbledore, there was the opportunity to draw on the variety of registers that exist in Yiddish. One of the most well-known ones is the amount of Lashon Kodesh words of Hebrew and Aramaic origin that you import into your Yiddish is a way of signaling how learned you are, how steeped in Torah and tradition and Talmud you are. And it seemed appropriate to conceive of Dumbledore as sort of a non-Jewish Rosh Yeshiva, a dean of a religious school. So I had him speaking a lot of Hebrew words without going over the line and making him seem like a religious person. So signaling knowledge of religious texts without coming across as religious. So very fine line there. And I think this is the last thing we'll touch on. There are many made-up objects and creatures in the Harry Potter universe, some which were imported from European folklore and world folklore, some of which were made up especially for Harry Potter. Over here is an image of the Niffler, which likes to collect coins. But in some cases, I was able to simply take a term that already existed in Yiddish and had a very clear correlate to what was intended by the author. So this is an image of the goblins from the movie. This is not how they're illustrated in the book, but this is from the movie. They run the Gringotts Wizarding Bank. We can perhaps talk a little bit later about whether or not this is an anti-Semitic caricature. Let's assume for now that it's not. But goblins are actually a very traditional Teutonic, Proto-Germanic, a piece of Proto-Germanic folklore. And the word in Germanic languages for this is a kobold, which we have a descendant of this word in English, a cobalt, which today typically we use to refer to an element, but cobalts was also used to refer to the spirits in the mines. So I was able to just call this a kobold because there was no question that that would be the right word. However, when it comes to an elf, it wasn't quite clear. Yiddish has a lot of terms, but I wasn't sure which to use because there wasn't exactly a one-to-one match. But I went hunting in the ethnographic collections of the YIVA, of the Jewish Research Institute, founded in Vilna in the 1910s, 1920s, that did an expedition across the countryside and gathered folklore. And this is an image of an elf from Harry Potter, a house elf. And one of the key features of the house elf is that they have a peculiar kind of magic. And when you give them clothes, they are freed forever. And it turns out that there was a story that was told among Ashkenazi Jews of a creature called a shretel, which would show up typically in your workshop. And it would show up at night and it would work all of your raw materials, and you would wake up in the morning and ta-da, your shoes are done. Ta-da, your bread is baked. And in the story, what would happen is the Baal Malacha, the artisan, would come out in the morning and say, I wonder what happened. And then they would peek at night and they would see that there's this little creature doing all this work. And the wife would say, oh, poor creature. It doesn't have any clothes. Let's give it some clothes. And so they would give it clothes, and the creature would say, thanks for the clothes. I'm out of here. And the creature would never come back. So amazingly, a really great parallel in shall we say, native Ashkenazi folklore. So a house elf is a shretel. And okay, so this is the last piece. Who's reading this? I said that I kind of was doing this for myself, for my own relationship with the Yiddish language. I can say that there's more people who are buying it than reading it. Meaning I think that there's a lot of people who feel a connection to Harry Potter, whether they're Jewish or not. The idea of having something that's Harry Potter, especially something in translation, it's a bit of a collector's item. And even Jews, those who don't speak Yiddish but have Yiddish as their tradition that was passed down from them, their Yerusha, their inheritance, feel that it's important to have a Yiddish book on their bookshelf. And if this will help them feel that connection, I'm very happy about that. And if it'll be an opportunity for people to practice reading Yiddish, to learn Yiddish, to stay in practice, and perhaps see this as an entryway into the amazing world of Yiddish literature beyond just translations of J.K. Rowling's young adult fantasy, then halavai omein. That would be wonderful. So that's it for me.
Well, thank you very much. That was just fascinating. And I'm sure there's some heavy questions here that need to be answered.
Yes. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to say, this is the book. It's really beautiful. It was actually published by a Jewish guy in Sweden, which is a story in and of itself of what Yiddish is doing in Sweden. But I will put a link to order the book if you are so inclined. I will put it in the chat, and I will also ask Sherry and/or Rabbi Jim to send out the link by email for anybody who isn't able to see it by chat. But you can see it there. It's $28, and it's free shipping from Sweden.
So one question that you didn't answer is Harry Potter a Yiddish book? Is Harry Potter a Jewish book?
Well, there's many different ways to answer the question. One could say that Harry Potter contains many Jewish themes, insofar that it tackles many universal themes, and deals with good and evil, and those are obviously questions that that Judaism tackles as well. I wouldn't say that Harry Potter in and of itself is a Jewish book. But I would say, or let me put it this way, I wouldn't say that Harry Potter in Yiddish is a Jewish book, but if somebody said, no, Harry Potter in Yiddish is not a Jewish book, I might bristle a little bit. So maybe I'm not willing to admit it to myself. But I think that in order to render something in Jewish language, it's somewhere in the middle. It's more of a Schrodinger's cat kind of situation.
Yeah.
Lauren Joseph has a question.
Hi. Tremendously enjoyed your presentation. I thought your readings were dramatically great, even though I don't speak Yiddish. Question I was going to ask is, how has Harry Potter, not your translation, but how has Harry Potter been received in the Yiddish community in general? Because there is actually a large community. And then have you got any preliminary feedback on your translation?
Yes. There are many, many people who are very upset that I did not call him Herschel Potter, but we've addressed that issue. The Yiddishist community, by which I mean people who are involved directly or peripherally with Yiddish outside of the Hasidic community, are always overjoyed when there are things related to Yiddish that come out. And of course, Harry Potter is a sensation in and of itself. So this is kind of an easy win. Among Hasidim, though, one would be surprised at how large the fringes are and how much of an interest there is in Yiddish Harry Potter, even among Hasidim. The critique that tends to come from the Hasidic community is, well, you're not really using my system of spelling, and there's a lot of words. There's a lot of words in your translation that I didn't understand. To which my response is, Yiddish is an incredibly diverse language and set of registers and dialects and varieties. And it's a wonderful thing to learn more. And if somebody wants to go ahead and publish a specifically Hasidic Yiddish translation of Harry Potter, which is tailored to the descendant of the Transcarpathian Hungarian dialect, be my guest. If you can get the copyright, go for it.
Well, that was going to be my next question, but actually the earlier part of my question was just how the whole Harry Potter canon, if I can use the word, has been received. Certainly in the evangelical world, it's been looked at as something, heretical.
Yes. It's certainly been banned by certain religious communities. My guess is that the Yiddish-speaking Hasidic community, at least as you go further into the nucleus and away from the fringes, they probably aren't familiar with Harry Potter, and there isn't as much of a risk of their kids reading it if it's not in Yiddish. And so the evangelical community has to be scared because there is a lot of literature out there that their kids could get a hand on. I think that for Hasidim, there is at least the perception, of course, they obviously haven't gotten their hands on secular Yiddish literature, But there's the perception that it doesn't pose as much of a danger.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Arun, are you planning to translate the entire series? Because I noticed as I was reading the books, both for myself and for the children, that they get they get bigger and bigger as they go along, and so the challenge would appear to grow as you move through the translations. I don't, and a related question, I'll just ask both, and you can decide how to deal with it. Have you read, I don't know what other languages you have besides Yiddish and Tamil. Have you read other translations to sort of figure out how those translators deal with the challenges of this text?
Yes. Okay, I'll deal with the first question first. I am aware that Harry Potter has been translated, that the first book has been translated into a number of languages, and stopped there because the idea was it's kind of a novelty. I'm not sure if there's more than one volume released of Ancient Greek, of Scots English, of Hawaiian, and I didn't want Yiddish to be a novelty. There's a lot of misconceptions out there about what Yiddish and what Yiddish isn't. Many people don't realize that Yiddish is a full-fledged language and that it's something beyond the English that many of us like to pepper our English with.
It's not Klingon, is what you're trying to say.
That's correct. It's not Klingon. And so I wanted to do it justice. So
Wait a minute. I heard that Klingon is a full language.
Klingon is a full language, but everybody will agree that Klingon is a novelty, I think.
No, I think Shakespeare sounds better in the original Klingon.
Indeed. As they say, verteidigt und verbessert, translated and improved. So yes, I want to do the second book. I'm halfway through it. We still have to get the copyright, and I now have to figure out how to have a 2-month-old and translate at the same time. Translating book 3 is kind of a distant dream. I think beyond that, I may call it quits, but bline that I'm not making any promises either way. In terms of translations, yes, I love learning languages. When I was at Harvard, actually, that was when I really got into learning languages. I probably took 7 or 8 different language courses when I was in undergrad. I took Welsh, Japanese, I took 3 years of, Yoruba, Persian, a few others as well. So I got a chance to really expand there. And I have read much of Harry Potter in translation, but I stopped as soon as I had an inkling that I was going to do the Yiddish translation. I immediately stopped looking at other translations, and I didn't look at them until after I finished the book, or I was trying to look up a very specific term and saying, okay, here's what I think I want to do. Let me go validate my hypothesis. Because I don't know if there are other translators here in the audience, but it's very easy to get influenced and to sort of to lose your spark of creativity if you get used to looking at what other people do. So I tried to come to a potential solution myself, and then take a look at what other books did. And there's a lot of them are really great translations. The German translation is fantastic. The French translation is great. The Hebrew is great. So there's a lot of great models to look at out there. I'll also add that for these major national languages, they did not have a lot of time to translate the book because it was kind of an arms race, and Harry Potter was all the rage, and so they were really on a time crunch. So many of these translators had to do these books in the span of 3 or 4 months. I had the pleasure of doing it over the course of 1.5 years or 2 years. So I was able to, not ever compromise on quality. Which
but presumably you are not a professional translator, whereas I would imagine that the other people who are doing these are professional translators. They don't have other jobs to.
Right, yeah, I'm not a professional translator. Right now, I work at Instagram, and while I was working on this, I was working at a startup. So no rest for the weird.
A question? Yep. Can you hear me? Yes. I wanted to ask, as you worked very, very, very closely with this book, did your own feeling about the characters and how you felt about them and how you felt about the events in the book undergo changes over the months that you were working on it? I was just curious about like when you focus very, very closely on any work of art, sometimes it sort of starts transforming as you get deeper and deeper into it. I just wondered how the characters and the events and so forth, whether you noticed any sympathy or lack of sympathy, anything changed about how you saw the people in the book and the events.
It's a great question. I've certainly gained a lot of sympathy for the Dursleys over the years. Harry's aunt and uncle, who, I mean, admittedly treat him absolutely horribly and bordering on, well, absolutely cruel and abusive at times. But I think I better understand now how they got to be the way that they are. But the other thing which is very interesting about the first book, and Rabbi Jim, this is actually speaking to your point about professional translators. I felt very intimidated going into this project because I'm not a professional translator. And I wasn't educated in Yiddish. You know, I went to modern Orthodox day schools. And so I had to really work hard to cultivate an ability to translate, to write in literary Yiddish. But I took solace in the fact that the first book of Harry Potter was in many ways Rowling's first attempt at writing a young adult fantasy novel. And you see her style really developing, her vocabulary, the way that she puts her sentences, her paragraphs together, the way that she develops the plot. And so that helped me feel a little bit more comfortable knowing that, yeah, maybe the sentence came out a little clumsy, but when I look at the original, it's a little clumsy too, and that's okay. You know, we're always all on a journey. But to your specific question about the characters, I did notice in the first book, Rowling does appear to be developing certain emotional relationships and attitudes between characters. And you can clearly see when she's experimenting with something that she ended up not going with. It's very, very clear to me that, who is it? That Harry and Hermione were initially intended to be a love interest. There are numerous scenes where Harry and Hermione are left alone together and they have a tender moment. I'm not sure why, but the author steered away from that in later books. But when you read the same same scene over and over and over again, you start to notice, hey, you know, Ron's in the room for this whole scene and yet he says nothing. What's up with that? So anyway, yes, could just be me.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Lauren.
I'm sorry, were you calling me?
Oh, sorry. I never lowered Lauren's hand. I've lowered your hand, Lauren. You may put your hand down.
I have a question. I was wondering if there are other works that you are particularly thinking about you'd like to see translated.
The reason why I did this to begin with, actually, I didn't mention this earlier, but my wife is really the Harry Potter junkie. My wife, Tali Adler, she was actually a rabbinic intern at Harvard Hillel a few years ago. Some of you may have met her. But she heard me say that I wanted to raise my children in Yiddish. And she said, well, you have to translate Harry Potter. And so she also said, well, okay, if you can't do Harry Potter, how about Narnia? How about something from Neil Gaiman, who does these like really amazing, fantastic fantasy works? So I've thought about something from Neil Gaiman. I think Narnia would be amazing, at least The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's a really, really magical work that I have very warm feelings for. And perhaps Tolkien's Silmarillion. That's all I've thought of so far, but those are all significant undertakings, and I'm not sure if I'm going to have the koyach or the time, but we'll see.
Has The Hobbit already been translated?
It has, actually, by what's the word for somebody from Massachusetts? A Massachusettsian, Western Mass. His name is Barry Goldstein, and he's
For the
translated.
Western part, that doesn't count.
Yeah, I know. There's not even a term for them, you know.
Anne has her hand raised.
And so does Helene. So.
Oh.
Yeah, knows
So does Dina.
Okay,
This
go.
is quick.
Anne first.
When my oldest grandson was about 7 and 8 reading this book, he got hold of his mother's iPhone and said, Siri, where can I buy a house elf? And they said, don't understand. And then came back again, does not compute. And what have you. Eventually, after a while of silence on Siri's part, she came back and said, you can get a house elf at Elf Electronics in Brookline, Massachusetts. He lives in Westford, so I think it was Brookline. It might have been further out the route, but I thought that was pretty clever of her.
Nice.
Helene. You have to unmute.
Mute yourself. Oh, I've unmuted you.
No, she's not unmuted. Oh,
Okay.
Muted. I am unmuted.
Yes, we hear you.
We hear me. All right. Question. Certainly in the first book where Rowling is setting up her conceit of a British boarding school inverted, and that's one example. The Dursleys are another example where she is doing very broad and obvious satirical renderings of standard English tropes and literary situations in young, especially the boarding school, literary situations in young adult literature that goes back to the 19th century, late 19th century. So does that need some, since there's no equivalent, I presume, no one wrote young adult books about the very famous yeshivas in Warsaw and so on. Where does one go to translate that spirit? Because it's very important, especially in the first book.
Yes, I think perhaps at the crux of this is the question of rendering a completely different culture, the British culture and all the things that come with that, the various stereotypes that come with that. Yeah, I definitely had to make up certain words. There was no word for detention in Yiddish, so I had to kind of just make up a term for that. And that's, of course, a pretty mundane one. Conveying
How about trainers and things that we're using the British edition or the American edition?
I initially made the mistake of using the American edition.
I used to have my books imported.
I wised up very quickly and switched over to the British edition. I also had my wife's mother and two of my brother-in-laws are British. So I had a whole panel of British cultural translators helping me out. There were actually a couple of places where I almost mistranslated a phrase because I didn't even know that it was a Briticism. So, for example, when Dumbledore says that Harry has to go live with the Dursleys because he would get so much attention in the wizarding world that it would be enough to turn any boy's head. I thought that meant it would be enough to turn the heads of people that he's walking past on the street. When I asked my British relatives, they all said, no, when your head gets turned, that means that you get a swollen head. It means you get arrogant. So for me, it was actually much less about conveying objects or moods, and much more about being very careful about not accidentally completely missing something that I didn't even realize had a British character. A complicated question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Question.
Adina, did you have a question?
I did. I was curious about the publisher, the Swedish. Did you say the publisher was Swedish? The,
Yes.
you know,
So Sweden in the early 1990s, the Swedish government decided to set aside government funding and commit to producing all government materials in a subset of minority languages.
Oh.
And the way they selected the minority languages were that there was a threshold for population size of that minority as of 1950. Now, in 1950, what minority groups were in Sweden? Of course, there were many Jews after the war.
Yeah.
And there were, Finns and Samis and Roma as well. And so Yiddish ended up being a language that today, if you're in court, you can request a Yiddish translator. You can get Yiddish dental hygiene materials, Yiddish sex education materials in Yiddish from the Swedish government. So it's really,
that's fascinating.
Quite
which dialect?
It's pretty neutral. So let's say standard Yiddish, but it's quite an the Yiddish word that I'm thinking of is chikava, quite a peculiar situation. So that has led to the springing up of various Yiddish enterprises, not just under the auspices of the Swedish government, but within the borders of the Swedish.
Fascinating. Oh my gosh.
Thank you for the question.
Very interesting.
I have a
Thank
question,
you.
and probably be the last one.
Great.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, you can't really separate Yiddish from Jewish culture. And I was wondering to what degree you think you've created a Yiddish version of Harry Potter rather than a translation.
Yes, it's an interesting question. I think that even 100 years ago, there was a flaming debate within the Jewish people of whether or not a Jewish secular culture was viable. This is a question that Zionists were trying to answer. This is a question that Yiddishists were trying to answer, territorialists. And so, although perhaps today Yiddish has been relegated to the corner of, well, this is obviously very Jewish and inextricably so because of it being spoken by Hasidim and because we associate it with the old world, which we might perceive of as being quote unquote irredeemably Jewish. But there was a committed secularist Yiddishist culture, which was anti-religion and in many ways anti-Judaism. The descendants of which continue to adhere to that tradition today. I mean, you have the Workmen's Circle in Brookline, which I taught Yiddish at while I was an undergrad. And so I think the answer is yes. One could certainly argue that Yiddish Harry Potter is not religious in character. It's certainly Yiddish in character. And if Yiddish is Jewish, then I suppose it's Jewish in character as well. But there is always going to be somebody who disagrees because these have always been around since, I suppose, the Haskalah. So, yeah, that question is yet to be resolved.
Very nice. Well, this has just been wonderful and fascinating, and I'm sure we could go on all night with our questions, but you have a life to lead. And so thank you very much. Go ahead.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
So
from
much.
me too.
Thank you.
Very
It's wonderful.
Thank you, Arun.
Thank you.
Maureen, it's
Thank
great
you.
to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much.
Jim and
I will,
Jeremy,
Great.
so much, Harriet. It's great to see you.
Zygazant.
I will send you the link and people can
Zygazant.
buy the book.
Arun,
We'll send out.
Arun, do you have a website?
I do not have a website myself. If you use Twitter, you can follow me there. But otherwise, you can feel free to order. I just put in my Twitter handle there. I'll ask Rabbi Jim or Sherry to send along the link to order
Yes.
the book, as well as
Yes, we'll do
your
that.
handle in case you're into that. And it's wonderful to see you all. And thank you so much for joining me. This was really a pleasure.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great to see
Thanks everyone for joining.
Yes.
Bye.
you coming.
Have a good night. Seid
Good night.
gesund. Gute Nacht.
Good night. Good
Good
night.
Nacht.
A
Good
gute
Nacht.
Nacht.
Yeah, good enough.
Yeah.
Or a
Big
gute
and
Nacht.
fast.
Sherry, thank you.
Oh,
That was great. It was so much fun. Wow.
it was great.
I started off with my Molly Pecan.
Oh,
Jim's. Quite an evening.
That was really great too. Wasn't it?
Yeah, that was so much fun. A real treat.
Yeah. You know, I have a letter from Molly Pecan hanging on our wall. I once interviewed her for Genesis 2.
Oh, yeah, I remember. Yes.
She and I are in the same, she's my people.
No, she's great. That was so much fun.
I
So,
haven't seen you in a while, Gina. You have to get together.
yeah. Yeah. It's,
And thanks a lot, Rabbi Jim, for all that tech and
Yes.
support.
I'm sorry that the polling didn't work. I don't know what happened, but it told me that
What do you mean it worked
It
perfectly?
did work. It did work.
it worked for
worked
everyone else but
perfectly.
me.
Yeah,
It
it
worked.
worked.
yeah, it worked.
We got it.
Yeah.
It
He
worked
tabulated
because
them. He
I
presented
think
the
it didn't
results.
work for me because I was dealing with this other situation that we had this, conflict, and I had to sign in as well on my iPad to send everybody over to the
Other room, the
other room.
breakout room. Yeah, the breakout
And
room.
so I don't know what happened, but it seemed to be all set, but then all of a sudden it wasn't set.
No, it was all set for us. We all had it.
I'm
And we
glad.
all had the
Yeah,
polls.
no,
They
it worked
all
out.
worked.
We saw the tabulation and everything.
Yeah. No, it was a great presentation, really fun, and I'm
It
really
was really fun. Really. It takes you into another world.
it certainly does. And
Oh, it was great. I thought there'd be a better turnout. I thought.
and it reminds me that how much fun I used to have when I used to read the Harry Potter
Yeah,
books to kids. I mean,
yeah.
I think it sounds to me like Jim and Sherry that your kids were a little bit too old for that.
No,
No, they were into
no,
it.
we read it. We read it.
Yeah.
Jim, you never read
I
it.
didn't read it, but Sherry and Akiva were into it.
Okay. No, because I read it.
Tamara was here. Tamara was here. I didn't get to chat with her because
Tamara was here for a little bit.
yeah.
I read it to both of my kids, and some of it was in the car, and some of it was in. I mean,
No, we were full into it. Tamara was into it.
yeah.
Is J.K. Rowling? She's still alive?
I'm sorry.
She's still alive, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But now she's persona non grata because she doesn't like transgender people. So yeah. But no. I mean, I remember we would go on family vacations, and I would be in the front seat, and my wife would be driving, and I would be reading Harry Potter.
Harry Potter, of course.
Kids from destroying the car. I mean, it was like,
Oh, it was a great book. I would love to read it in Yiddish. That would be so fun.
I know. We could have a little Yiddish group we could read.
I think that we would finish it in the next world.
Right. I know, right. Right.
Arun looked a little bit shocked when I was, asking about how much he was going to translate. So basically, he said he was going to translate 3 of them if he can.
Yeah.
But they get longer and longer as they go. I mean,
Well, it's
I
not
know
his.
some
It's
of the
not
latter
his
ones,
main.
number 7, is like the size of a sequoia.
Right. I mean, she turned into what we call in Russian a graphoman, which is a graphomaniac. And but she wasn't that when she started, but she turned into that, which is a pity because.
Well, it's not his main profession, but who knows? After this, he might really be.
I mean, if there's enough to buy it, but $18 a copy, he's not going to make a lot of money.
It's too bad. I wonder what they're going to do with Yiddish Week, the Klez camp in New York City this year. Maybe they'll do it on Zoom. That would be a nice addition to that. I mean, I'm sure there are people who would have a good time with that.
Anyway, good night, everybody.
Anyway, good night.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.
So